Humanity learned early that the universe did not care whether it was watched. Stars burned with the same ferocity, whether named or unnamed, and the spaces between them swallowed sound and intention without comment. The first human vessels to cross beyond their cradle did not do so with triumphal banners or choirs of triumph, but with layered redundancies, stubborn engineering, and crews trained to assume that nothing beyond their hulls would ever be merciful. Those early lessons endured, carried forward not as myths, but as habits, as ways of thinking that seeped into every later decision. When the vessel Pilgrim Thread slipped through the boundary between charted space and the uncooperative dark beyond, it did so with the same mindset. That survival was earned minute by minute, system by system, through attention and resolve. The Pilgrim Thread was not beautiful by any aesthetic measure favored by the older stellar polities. Its hull plates bore the subtle asymmetries of iterative repair, its radiators unfolded like the ribs of a patient animal, and its interior spaces favored function over ceremony. The crew moved through its corridors with an ease born of shared labor rather than hierarchy. At its core, a lattice of human-built reactors hummed with a layered resonance that could be felt through the soles of boots, a vibration that spoke of containment barely maintained through constant vigilance. This ship had been sent not as a herald, but as a probe of intent, a test of whether humanity could enter a region long avoided by others and return with more than losses tallied. That region had no agreed name. Charts from non-human archives referred to it with symbols denoting instability, contested gravitational flows, and unpredictable causal eddies. The polities that traded in such charts had learned to draw a wide arc around it, for their doctrines prized continuity and equilibrium above all else. Humanity, by contrast, had grown within a system that offered neither, and so had learned to adapt by expecting disruption rather than fearing it. Where others saw a scar in the stellar tapestry, human analysts saw a challenge that could be bounded, measured, and possibly mastered. Captain Sorath Kime of the Pilgrim Thread did not indulge in speeches before the crossing. He stood at the central command well, hands resting lightly on the rail, eyes tracking the flow of data across layered displays. His hair had gone fully gray during the long years of orbital construction work that preceded humanity's first interstellar treaties, and his face bore the deep-set lines of someone who had spent more time thinking through failure modes than celebrating successes. Around him, the crew made final adjustments with quiet efficiency, voices low, movements precise. There was no countdown voiced aloud, no ceremonial mark. The transition came as a subtle lurch, a sensation like gravity briefly forgetting its own direction, and then the stars rearranged themselves. On the far side, the universe felt wrong in ways that instruments struggled to quantify. Distances compressed and expanded in uneven pulses, and the background radiation whispered of processes that did not align with standard cosmological models. The Pilgrim Thread held together because its designers had assumed that equations would lie when confronted with reality and had built margins accordingly. Even so, alarms flared and were acknowledged, systems rebalanced themselves, and the ship's internal network rerouted power through paths that had not been used since simulation trials. The first sign that they were not alone came not as a contact on sensors, but as a discrepancy in causality. A probe launched ahead of the vessel reported data before it should have been able to transmit it, a paradox that forced the analysis teams into a flurry of recalibration. The data itself showed nothing remarkable, a stretch of space with a faint particulate haze and a distant gravitational well, but the timing was impossible. Humanity had encountered strange physics before, but this was different, less a violation and more a negotiation, as if the universe in this region operated on terms that could be bargained with, if one knew how to ask. The Pilgrim Thread advanced cautiously, deploying more probes, each one mapped against the others to triangulate not just position, but temporal relation. It was during this careful advance that they detected the structure. It hung in space like a wound that had been carefully sutured, layers of material folded around a core that radiated controlled energy. Its scale dwarfed the human vessel, yet its construction bore signs of restraint, of an intelligence that built not to dominate space, but to endure within it. No broadcasts emanated from it, no active scans that could be interpreted as threat. It simply existed, anchored within the unstable region as if it had grown there. Human doctrine dictated patience. The pilgrim thread held position at the edge of what its models defined as tolerable risk and began a thorough observation cycle. Over days that felt longer due to the region's temporal peculiarities, the crew mapped the structure's emissions, its gravitational interactions, and the subtle ways it influenced the surrounding space. Patterns emerged, complex but consistent, suggesting a civilization that had adapted to these conditions not by fleeing them, but by integrating them into their technology. First contact, when it came, was initiated by the other party, but on terms that reflected an understanding of human psychology that was unsettling in its accuracy. A signal reached the pilgrim thread that did not travel through conventional channels. It manifested instead as a structured anomaly in the ship's own internal network, a sequence of states that encoded meaning without language. Human systems flagged it as an intrusion, but the intrusion did not seek control, only attention. When the crew isolated and translated the pattern, it resolved into a simple proposition: recognition without dominance, exchange without absorption. The beings that emerged from the structure did not resemble humanity in any superficial way. Their forms were articulated around a central mass of adaptive tissue, surrounded by manipulators that shifted configuration depending on task. Their surfaces shimmered with layered fields that responded to environmental changes faster than any biological reflex. Yet beneath these differences lay a familiar cadence of intent. They approached not as conquerors or supplicants, but as neighbors long accustomed to watching others skirt their home and wondering why. Communication unfolded slowly, built on shared observation rather than imposed syntax. The inhabitants of the structure, who identified themselves through a concept approximating enduring convergence, explained that they had settled in this region because it filtered out those who sought simplicity. The unstable physics acted as a sieve, admitting only those willing to engage with complexity without expectation of immediate reward. For ages uncounted, they had watched stellar polities rise and ossify, their doctrines calcifying until adaptation became anathema. Humanity, arriving in a vessel held together by pragmatic stubbornness, represented something different. As exchanges deepened, it became clear that the enduring convergence had catalogued many species that had approached their region and retreated. The records spoke of elegant fleets turned back by minor anomalies, of powerful coalitions undone by their own inflexibility. Humanity's data, by contrast, was a mess of annotations, contingency plans, and notes on failures that had been incorporated into subsequent designs. The enduring convergence found this both alien and intriguing. They had long believed that mastery came from minimizing error. Humans seemed to embrace it as a teacher. The first crisis of the encounter tested this tentative bond. A surge in the region's underlying instability threatened to collapse a swath of space that included both the structure and the pilgrim thread. The enduring convergence had protocols to ride out such events, but the surge exceeded historical parameters. Their systems strained, adaptations lagging behind the sudden shift. The human vessel, smaller and less specialized, should by all rights have fared worse. Instead, its layered redundancies and crew trained to improvise allowed it to respond with surprising agility. Without waiting for formal agreement, Captain Sorethkheim authorized the sharing of human stabilization algorithms, rough and inelegant, by the standards of the enduring convergence, but designed to function under partial information. Human engineers worked alongside non-human counterparts through mediated interfaces, translating not just code, but philosophy. Where the enduring convergence sought to restore a prior equilibrium, humans aimed to find any configuration that did not lead to immediate destruction, trusting that refinement could come later. The surge passed, leaving damage in its wake, but sparing both parties annihilation. In the aftermath, something fundamental shifted. The enduring convergence recognized that humanity's strength did not lie in superior technology or numbers, but in a cultural acceptance of uncertainty as a constant companion. They had built a society that could bend without breaking because it had never expected the universe to conform. Humanity, in turn, glimpsed a form of endurance that was not static but adaptive over epochs, a patience that could complement human urgency. As the Pilgrim thread prepared to transmit its findings back to human space, the enduring convergence offered a final exchange. They opened a segment of their archives that detailed not weapons or defenses, but failures, catalogued with meticulous honesty. Civilizations that had approached them with demands had been catalogued and dismissed. Those that had sought assimilation had been absorbed and lost. Humanity, which had arrived asking how to survive together in a difficult place, was offered something rarer: partnership in exploration of the regions others avoided. When the Pilgrim thread eventually turned back toward known space, it did so changed, its holds carrying not artifacts, but frameworks of thought. Captain Sorath Kime recorded a final log entry before the transition, noting that humanity had once again found its measure not by imposing order, but by meeting the universe where it was and refusing to yield to despair. Beyond the hull, the unstable stars continued their indifferent dance, but within the vessel, a quiet certainty took root. Humanity had found another way to belong among the unyielding stars, not as masters, but as participants willing to learn, adapt, and endure. The return transit of the Pilgrim thread did not unwind itself neatly. Space within the unstable regions seemed reluctant to let go, as if the patterns the ship had traced through it left an impression that needed time to fade. Instruments registered echoes of probability that followed the vessel like contrails, phantom possibilities that flickered and vanished as the human-built drives pushed forward. The crew adapted, as they always did, treating each anomaly as a temporary complication rather than an omen. Procedures were adjusted, logs annotated, and the long habit of human spaceflight asserted itself once more: assume persistence, plan for degradation, and keep moving. News of the encounter reached human space before the ship itself did. Data packets threaded through relay chains, compressed and layered with contextual warnings that emphasized interpretation over spectacle. Analysts across scattered habitats and orbital stations pored over the information, arguing not about whether the enduring convergence existed, but about what their presence implied. Humanity had learned that discovery was rarely a single moment. It was a process of social digestion, where implications were debated, reframed, and integrated into existing narratives. This discovery challenged several of those narratives at once. The prevailing assumption among many human polities had been that advanced civilizations either expanded until they fractured or stabilized into rigid forms that eventually collapsed. The enduring convergence represented a third path, one that did not prioritize expansion or stasis, but selective engagement. They had not conquered their region nor fled it. They had learned to live within it, shaping themselves around its demands. For some human commentators, this was an indictment of humanity's own restless push outward. For others, it was validation that resilience, not dominance, was the true measure of longevity. Within months of the Pilgrim thread's return, a new expedition was authorized. This one would not be a single vessel, but a small flotilla each ship built on different design philosophies, unified only by a shared commitment to adaptability. The idea was not to present a unified front, but a spectrum of approaches, a demonstration that humanity's strength lay in diversity of method rather than uniform doctrine. Captain Sorath Kime declined a second command, citing the need for fresh perspectives. Instead, he took on an advisory role, his experience shaping the mission parameters without constraining them. Among the flotilla's crews was Nira Valen, a systems architect whose career had been defined by projects that others deemed too unstable to pursue. She had grown up on a habitat whose orbit decayed faster than anticipated, forcing its inhabitants to constantly revise their assumptions about permanence. To her, the idea of engaging with a civilization that thrived amid instability felt less like exploration and more like a homecoming. She was assigned to the vessel Wayfarer Knot, a ship whose modular design allowed entire sections to be reconfigured mid-mission, a trait that many considered excessive until they saw it in action. As the flotilla approached the boundary of the unstable region, they detected changes that had not been present during the Pilgrim Thread's passage. The enduring convergence had been busy. Structures had been extended, not outward in a bid for control, but inward, deepening their integration with the region's shifting physics. It was as if they had anticipated humanity's return and prepared not defenses, but interfaces. The first contact protocols were activated on both sides, refined by prior experience, but still tentative, like a handshake repeated after a long absence. This time, communication unfolded more quickly. Shared frameworks allowed concepts to be exchanged with less friction, though misunderstandings still arose. The enduring convergence struggled with the human tendency to anthropomorphize systems, while humans found the convergence's collective identity difficult to map onto familiar social models. Yet each misstep was treated not as a failure, but as data. Clarifications were offered, assumptions corrected, and the dialogue deepened through mutual effort. The enduring convergence revealed more of their history, prompted in part by human curiosity that bordered on intrusive by non-human standards. They spoke of an era before their settlement, when they had been a migratory species, moving from star to star in search of environments that matched their biological preferences. Each migration had been driven by necessity rather than ambition, and each new home required adaptation. Over time, they realized that the universe offered no perfect refuge, only gradients of challenge. The unstable region, once avoided, became attractive precisely because it forced continuous adjustment, preventing the stagnation that had doomed earlier societies they had observed. Human listeners recognized echoes of their own past. Earth, with its shifting climates and tectonic restlessness, had shaped a species accustomed to change. The enduring convergence's choice resonated deeply, reinforcing a sense of kinship that transcended form. Yet differences remained. Where humans often framed adaptation as a struggle to be overcome, the convergence spoke of it as a state to be maintained, a balance between effort and acceptance. The flotilla's presence did not go unnoticed by other powers. Long-range observers from distant polities detected the increased activity near the unstable region and began to reassess their long-standing avoidance. Rumors circulated of humans establishing a foothold where none had dared, and speculation followed familiar lines. Some feared a new axis of power forming, one that could leverage the region's hazards as a strategic shield. Others dismissed the idea, confident that instability would eventually claim any who lingered. These external pressures added urgency to the human convergence dialogue. The enduring convergence had little interest in becoming a focal point for interstellar rivalry. They had chosen their isolation deliberately, not out of fear, but out of a desire to cultivate a particular way of existence. Humanity, meanwhile, had to confront the reality that its actions were rarely perceived in isolation. Even well-intentioned engagement could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. A pivotal moment came when a human scout vessel detected a probe of non-human origins skirting the edge of the region. Its design bore hallmarks of a polity known for its meticulous planning and intolerance for uncertainty. The probe did not enter the unstable zone, but it lingered, collecting data, its presence a silent question. The enduring convergence interpreted this as a precursor, a test before potential incursion. They asked humanity, directly and without preamble, what it intended to do if others followed. The question forced a reckoning. Humanity could not claim neutrality without consequence. To engage with the enduring convergence was to become part of their context, whether desired or not. Nira Valen found herself at the center of the ensuing debate, her technical expertise intertwined with ethical considerations. She argued that the answer lay not in deterrence or secrecy, but in transparency coupled with resilience. If the region was to be approached by others, then its true nature, challenges and all, should be evident. Let those who valued control see what control cost here. The enduring convergence considered this perspective carefully. They had long curated their obscurity, but humanity's approach offered a different kind of protection, one rooted in informed choice rather than enforced distance. After extended deliberation, they agreed to a limited disclosure, allowing human channels to disseminate accurate, unembellished data about the region's demands. It was a gamble, trusting that knowledge would deter those unprepared rather than entice them. As preparations were made to share this information, the unstable region asserted itself once more. A cascading shift in local spacetime began, more severe than previous surges. Models struggled to predict its trajectory, and both human and convergent systems flagged escalating risk. The flotilla faced a choice: withdraw to safety or commit to a coordinated response that would test the limits of their cooperation. Withdrawal would preserve lives and data, but it would also signal to watching powers that the region remained unconquerable, reinforcing existing narratives. Staying would demonstrate something else entirely, a willingness to confront instability together without guarantees. After brief but intense consultation, the decision was made to stay. What followed was not a battle, but a marathon of adaptation. Human ships reconfigured themselves on the fly, modules detaching and reattaching as stresses shifted. The enduring convergence extended adaptive fields, their technology flowing like liquid architecture to support weakened areas of spacetime. Communication channels remained open throughout, not just for commands, but for continuous feedback, a shared situational awareness that blurred the line between species. Nira Valen found herself coordinating between teams that thought in fundamentally different ways. Human engineers proposed brute force solutions that accepted collateral strain, while convergence specialists sought elegant adjustments that preserved long-term balance. The synthesis emerged through iteration, each side learning when to yield and when to push. The surge peaked and began to subside, leaving behind a region altered but intact. In the aftermath, the watching probe withdrew, its data likely filled with contradictions and unresolved variables. Humanity and the enduring convergence had demonstrated not dominance, but competence under pressure. That message, subtle as it was, carried weight. As the flotilla prepared to rotate crews and bring fresh personnel into the region, a new phase of engagement began. Joint research initiatives were established, focused not on exploitation, but on understanding the principles that allowed life to persist amid uncertainty. Young humans volunteered eagerly, drawn by the challenge and the chance to learn from a civilization that had made peace with change. The enduring convergence, for their part, began to incorporate human narratives into their own records, not as curiosities, but as case studies in adaptive culture. Neera Valen recorded her observations in a personal log, reflecting on how quickly the unfamiliar had become routine. She noted that humanity's greatest contribution was not any specific technology, but a mindset forged through millennia of precarious survival. In the unstable region, that mindset found resonance, not as an anomaly, but as a complementary force. By the end of the chapter's events, the idea of the unstable region as a boundary began to dissolve. It was no longer simply a place to be avoided or conquered, but a crucible where different approaches to existence could meet and test themselves. Humanity had stepped into that crucible not as a conqueror, but as a participant willing to be changed. The stars beyond the region continued their indifferent burning, but within this pocket of negotiated chaos, a new pattern took shape. It was fragile, contingent, and deeply uncertain, and that, perhaps, was its greatest strength. Time behaved differently once cooperation became routine. Days still passed according to human chronometers, and cycles still flowed within the enduring convergence's own metrics, but the subjective experience of effort compressed. Problems that once would have taken months of unilateral study were now addressed through shared labor, with parallel approaches probing the same question from incompatible but complementary angles. The unstable region did not become calmer, but it became legible in a way it had not been before, like a storm whose moods could be read even if they could not be commanded. Joint installations began as tentative constructs, small nodes anchored where probability gradients were relatively shallow. Humans favored physical redundancy, lattice frameworks with multiple independent supports, while the enduring convergence extended adaptive fields that redistributed stress rather than resisting it outright. The resulting hybrids looked ungainly by the standards of both cultures, but they worked. Each installation became a lesson written in matter and energy, a record of compromises that preserved function without demanding purity. As these nodes multiplied, so did attention from outside. The data humanity released about the region had the intended effect of deterring those who sought certainty above all else, but it also attracted actors driven by curiosity, desperation, or ideological rigidity. Not all who watched from afar interpreted transparency as warning. Some saw it as challenge. Long-range signals began to brush the periphery, polite inquiries wrapped around implicit demands for access, for oversight, for guarantees that could not honestly be given. Human governance structures struggled to respond with a single voice. Humanity had never been monolithic, and the diaspora among the stars had only deepened those fractures. Some factions argued that the enduring convergence represented an opportunity that needed to be secured before others interfered. Others warned that any attempt to formalize control would betray the very principles that made the cooperation viable. Debates flared across networks, spilling into public forums where citizens far removed from the unstable region projected their hopes and fears onto it. Within the region, those debates felt distant, almost abstract. The crews and convergence collectives working side by side were occupied with immediate concerns, calibrating instruments, reinforcing strained structures, and responding to the region's constant improvisations. Yet the external pressures seeped inward through policy directives and delayed approvals, subtle constraints that reminded everyone that their work existed within a larger political context. Neera Valen became increasingly aware of this tension as her role expanded. What had begun as a technical assignment evolved into a mediating position, translating not just between species, but between distant decision-makers and those living with the consequences of those decisions. She found herself advocating for flexibility in the face of demands for predictability, arguing that rigid frameworks would fail in a place defined by variance. The enduring convergence observed these dynamics with a mixture of interest and concern. They had witnessed similar patterns before, in civilizations that approached their region carrying unresolved internal conflicts. Often, those conflicts proved more dangerous than any external threat. In a series of candid exchanges, they shared these observations with human counterparts, not as warnings, but as data points. Humanity listened, uncomfortably aware of the parallels. The first true test of these internal strains came not from a foreign incursion, but from a failure of trust. A human research vessel, operating under a separate mandate, initiated an unsanctioned experiment near one of the joint installations, attempting to force a localized stabilization of spacetime. The experiment was conceived in good faith, driven by a belief that partial control could yield valuable insights, but it underestimated the region's sensitivity. The resulting feedback cascade damaged the installation and injured members of both species. The response was immediate and intense. Human crews rushed to contain the damage, while the enduring convergence extended emergency adaptations to prevent a wider collapse. Lives were saved, but the incident left scars, physical and psychological. More damaging than the injuries was the breach of confidence. The enduring convergence questioned whether humanity could truly align its actions with its stated values when internal factions operated without coordination. Accountability followed, uneven and fraught. The vessel responsible was recalled, its leadership censured, but the process exposed the limits of human oversight across vast distances. Nira Valen participated in difficult conversations with convergence representatives, acknowledging the failure without offering excuses. She emphasized that humanity's strength lay not in perfection, but in its capacity to confront mistakes openly and learn from them. The enduring convergence deliberated at length. Their decision-making processes were not opaque, but they unfolded on timescales that challenged human patience. During this period, joint operations slowed, and a palpable tension settled over the region. Some humans feared that the partnership might fracture, reinforcing the arguments of those who had opposed deep engagement from the outset. When the convergence finally responded, their stance surprised many. They chose not to withdraw nor to impose restrictions, but to deepen integration. They proposed the creation of shared oversight structures, not to enforce compliance, but to embed awareness. By intertwining human and convergence processes, they aimed to reduce the likelihood of unilateral action born of incomplete understanding. It was a risky move, one that increased mutual vulnerability, but it aligned with their long-held belief that isolation bred stagnation. Implementing this proposal required profound adjustments. Human crews had to accept levels of transparency that challenged ingrained notions of autonomy. The enduring convergence had to open aspects of their internal deliberations that they had never shared with outsiders. The process was uncomfortable and slow, marked by misunderstandings and moments of defensiveness. Yet over time, a new rhythm emerged, one where decisions were informed by a richer tapestry of perspectives. As this integration progressed, the unstable region revealed deeper layers of complexity. Phenomena previously dismissed as noise resolved into patterns when viewed through combined analytical frameworks. Humans contributed statistical methods honed on chaotic systems, while the convergence applied experiential heuristics accumulated over generations of direct exposure. Together, they identified corridors of relative predictability, not fixed routes, but probabilistic pathways that could be navigated with care. These discoveries had implications beyond the region itself. They suggested that other areas of space, long deemed uninhabitable, might be accessible through similar approaches. The prospect ignited imaginations across human space, fueling visions of expansion into realms previously closed. The enduring convergence greeted this enthusiasm with measured caution, reminding their partners that access did not equate to suitability and that not every challenge needed to be claimed. External interest intensified as rumors of these findings spread. A coalition of distant polities issued a formal request for inclusion in the research, framing it as a cooperative endeavor. Beneath the diplomatic language lay competing motives: fear of being left behind, desire for leverage, and genuine curiosity. Humanity found itself in an unfamiliar position, not as a junior participant, but as a gatekeeper of sorts, its actions setting precedents. The decision of how to respond was contentious. Some argued that broader inclusion would diffuse tension and distribute responsibility. Others warned that introducing actors unprepared for the region's demands could destabilize the fragile balance achieved. The enduring convergence deferred to humanity's judgment, a gesture of trust that carried significant weight. Ultimately, a limited invitation was extended, contingent on strict adherence to shared protocols and a commitment to transparency. The first observers arrived cautiously, their vessels hovering at the margins, crews peering into a domain that defied their training. Initial interactions were stiff, burdened by preconceptions, but exposure began to erode certainty. The region did not yield to authority or prestige. It responded only to attentiveness and adaptability. Not all visitors adapted. Some withdrew after brief exposure, citing unacceptable risk. Others attempted to impose familiar control structures and retreated in frustration when those structures failed. A few, however, began to learn. They observed how humans and the enduring convergence interacted, how disagreements were surfaced rather than suppressed, how failure was treated as information rather than shame. For those observers, the experience was transformative. Within the joint community, a new generation of shared practices took root. Training programs emerged that paired human novices with convergence mentors, each learning the other's modes of perception. Language itself evolved, with hybrid metaphors arising to describe phenomena neither culture could fully capture alone. These developments were not mandated, they emerged organically from sustained contact. Nira Valen reflected on these changes during rare moments of rest. She recognized that humanity was undergoing a subtle shift, one that might not be visible in policy documents or public declarations, but would shape future decisions. The experience of working in the unstable region was recalibrating expectations, fostering a comfort with ambiguity that contrasted sharply with the certainty-driven narratives prevalent elsewhere. The chapter closed on a quiet moment rather than a crisis. A human and a convergence observer stood together at a viewport, watching a localized distortion ripple and fade. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The scene encapsulated the core lesson of their shared endeavor, that endurance did not require control, only the willingness to remain present, attentive, and responsive as the universe unfolded on its own terms. Beyond them, the unstable region continued its restless motion, indifferent yet strangely accommodating. Humanity had not tamed it, nor had it been consumed by it. Instead, a relationship had formed, contingent and evolving, offering no guarantees beyond the opportunity to keep learning. The unstable region did not announce its deeper challenges with spectacle. There were no singular cataclysms, no clear thresholds crossed with fanfare. Instead, complexity accumulated quietly, like stress in a material that appeared sound until it was not. As joint operations expanded and more actors skirted the margins, subtle interactions compounded. Probability corridors shifted, feedback loops overlapped, and systems that had been tuned to earlier conditions found themselves operating on outdated assumptions. It was not a crisis of violence or betrayal, but of scale. The enduring convergence had long understood that endurance was not merely about surviving acute events, but about recognizing when incremental change altered the underlying character of a system. They began to express concern that the region itself was responding to the increased attention, not reacting with intent, but reorganizing under the weight of observation and intervention. Humans, accustomed to feedback effects in ecological and economic systems, grasped the analogy quickly. Observation was not neutral here. Presence mattered. This realization forced a difficult reassessment. The joint community had framed its work as adaptive coexistence, but even adaptation exerted pressure. Every installation, every vessel transit, every measurement nudged the region's behavior. The question was no longer whether they could survive within it, but whether they could do so without transforming it into something else entirely. Nera Valen found herself once again in the midst of deliberations that blurred technical, ethical, and philosophical boundaries. Data showed that certain stabilization techniques, when applied repeatedly, reduced local volatility but increased strain elsewhere, redistributing instability rather than dissipating it. Humans recognized the pattern from their own history, from river control projects that prevented floods in one area only to cause devastation downstream. The enduring convergence saw echoes of past mistakes made by others who had sought comfort through incremental control. The first response was restraint. Joint protocols were revised to limit interventions to those strictly necessary for survival, and some installations were decommissioned or allowed to drift out of phase. This withdrawal was not easy. It meant abandoning research threads and accepting gaps in understanding. It also meant confronting a deeply ingrained human impulse, that knowledge justified presence. Here, knowledge might require absence. Not all humans agreed. Outside the region, pressure mounted from factions that saw the unstable zone as a proving ground, a place where humanity could demonstrate maturity through mastery. They argued that careful management could scale, that early signs of systemic strain were simply calibration issues. Their models promised long-term stability through comprehensive oversight, a familiar assurance that resonated with those far removed from the region's day-to-day realities. The enduring convergence listened to these arguments with measured patience. They did not dismiss them outright, but contextualized them within a longer view. They shared records of civilizations that had reached similar inflection points, where incremental optimization crossed into qualitative change. In those cases, the environment that had once supported adaptation became brittle, losing the very variability that sustained resilience. Collapse, when it came, was swift and irreversible. These records were not presented as moral lessons, but as empirical histories. Humanity was left to draw its own conclusions. Within the joint community, consensus leaned toward caution, but governance structures beyond it were slower to shift. Authority diffused across human space meant that no single decision could bind all actors. The risk of unilateral action loomed once more. That risk materialized sooner than expected. A consortium operating under a distant mandate initiated a large-scale experiment at the periphery of the region, deploying an array designed to dampen fluctuations across a broad volume. Their stated aim was to create a stable corridor that could support regular transit, opening the region to controlled use. The array activated without coordination with the joint oversight structures, its influence rippling inward like a slow tide. The effects were immediate and alarming. Localized calm gave way to intensified turbulence elsewhere as the region's internal balances shifted. Joint installations registered rising stress levels, and adaptive systems struggled to compensate for changes that exceeded prior experience. It was not catastrophic, but it was trending that way. Emergency communication channels lit up. The consortium defended its actions, citing prior disclosures and asserting that their experiment fell within acceptable parameters. From their perspective, the disruption was temporary, a necessary cost of progress. From within the region, the cost looked far from acceptable. What followed was the most severe test of the partnership to date. Humans within the region faced the reality that their species could not be treated as a single actor, and that trust extended to humanity as a whole was inherently risky. The enduring convergence did not accuse. but they did withdraw certain adaptive supports, prioritizing the preservation of the region over the accommodation of human missteps. Faced with escalating instability, Valen and others proposed a radical response. Rather than counteracting the consortium's array with forceful measures that would further stress the system, they suggested leveraging the region's own dynamics. By introducing controlled variability in targeted areas, they aimed to re-establish distributed balance, not by suppressing change, but by amplifying it where needed. It was an approach deeply aligned with convergence philosophy and informed by human experience with chaotic systems. Implementing this plan required cooperation from the very consortium whose actions had triggered the crisis. Convincing them demanded a shift from abstract debate to embodied consequence. Real-time data streams were opened, allowing distant decision-makers to witness the cascading effects of their intervention. Models were replaced with lived telemetry, projections with unfolding reality. Some resisted, clinging to assurances that their systems would self-correct. Others, confronted with the immediacy of potential collapse, relented. Authorization was granted for the joint response, though not without conditions and lingering resentment. The operation unfolded over a tense interval that defied simple measurement. Human vessels reconfigured once more, not to impose structure, but to seed variability. The enduring convergence extended adaptive fields in unconventional patterns, deliberately introducing asymmetries that encouraged the region to redistribute stress internally. It was counterintuitive, even unsettling, to those trained to equate stability with uniformity. Gradually, indicators shifted. Turbulence spread but softened, peaks flattening as energy found new pathways. The corridor created by the consortium's array lost definition, dissolving back into probabilistic gradients. The array itself was powered down under joint supervision, its operators chastened but not vilified. When the region settled into a new equilibrium, it was not identical to its prior state. Some areas became more volatile, others less so. The change was permanent, but not destructive. The region had adapted, as it always did, incorporating disturbance into its ongoing evolution. In the aftermath, consequences followed. The consortium faced internal reckoning, their unilateral authority curtailed by broader agreement. Humanity's governance structures began, haltingly, to incorporate lessons from the region, emphasizing responsibility proportional to impact rather than proximity. It was an imperfect process, but it marked a shift. The enduring convergence, observing these developments, adjusted their assessment of humanity. They had always known humans were capable of error. What mattered was response. In choosing to expose internal fractures rather than conceal them, humanity demonstrated a capacity for collective learning that few civilizations sustained at scale. On a quieter note, Valen visited one of the earliest joint installations, now partially decommissioned. She walked its corridors, noting where human framework met convergence adaptation, where compromises had been etched into material form. The installation would eventually be dismantled entirely, its components repurposed or allowed to drift. Its legacy would persist not as a monument, but as a lesson. She recorded a final entry for the cycle, reflecting that the measure of progress here was not accumulation, but discernment. Knowing when to act, when to withdraw, and when to accept change without resistance. Humanity had entered the unstable region seeking understanding. What it was finding instead was humility, earned through engagement rather than retreat. Beyond the hull, space flexed and flowed, indifferent yet responsive. The region did not care who studied it or why, it only responded to what was done within it. For the first time, humanity was beginning to grasp that distinction, and in doing so, was learning how to endure without erasing the very challenges that gave endurance meaning. After the crisis subsided, the unstable region entered a phase that could only be described as contemplative. Fluctuations persisted, but their rhythms shifted, no longer clustering around human or convergence activity alone. The region had absorbed disturbance and redistributed it, and in doing so, had altered the context in which all future actions would occur. For those living and working within it, this change carried a weight that was less urgent than disaster, yet more profound than success. It forced a reckoning with permanence. Human presence could no longer be framed as provisional. Even restraint had left traces. The enduring convergence articulated this reality with characteristic precision. The region now included humanity as a variable, not an external influence to be filtered or ignored, but an embedded factor whose behavior would shape long-term dynamics. This was not an accusation. It was a statement of state. The implication unsettled many humans more than any previous danger. For generations, humanity had defined exploration as reversible. Ships could leave, stations could be dismantled, mistakes could be abandoned. Here, withdrawal would not restore an earlier condition. The region would continue to evolve with the imprint of human choices folded into its unfolding structure. Responsibility, once diffuse, now felt irrevocable. In response, the joint community entered a period of deliberate slowing. Expansion halted entirely. No new installations were authorized, and existing ones were assessed not for productivity, but for necessity. Crews rotated less frequently, favoring continuity over fresh enthusiasm. The enduring convergence mirrored this shift, reducing the rate at which they incorporated new adaptive architectures. Together, they allowed the system to breathe. This slowing had social consequences. For humans accustomed to momentum, the absence of forward motion bred unease. Careers built on discovery stalled. Funding bodies questioned the value of patience. Outside commentators derided the pause as stagnation, evidence that humanity lacked the resolve to finish what it started. Within the region, those critiques felt hollow, but they were not without effect. Neera Valen felt the tension acutely. Her work had always been about navigating uncertainty through action, yet now action itself was suspect. She spent long periods in observation, reviewing data that changed slowly, if at all. In those stretches, reflection replaced urgency. She began to see patterns not just in the region's behavior, but in her own responses to it. The enduring convergence engaged humanity during this period in an unexpected way. They proposed a comprehensive exchange not of technology or data, but of failure narratives. Humanity was asked to share detailed accounts of projects abandoned, societies destabilized, and ambitions curtailed by unintended consequence. Not summaries or lessons learned, but full, unfiltered records, including debates, doubts, and rationalizations. This request struck at a sensitive nerve. Human cultures varied widely in how they remembered failure. Some preserved it meticulously, others reframed it as progress, still others buried it beneath myth. To compile such a record required confronting uncomfortable truths about agency and denial. Resistance was immediate, particularly from institutions that feared reputational harm. Yet participation grew, driven by individuals rather than mandates. Engineers submitted postmortems of habitats lost to cascading systems failures. Ecologists contributed archives of well-intentioned interventions that led to collapse. Political historians offered transcripts of debates where warning signs were acknowledged and dismissed. The process was painful, but it was also clarifying. The enduring convergence received these records with a gravity that surprised many. They did not analyze them for tactical advantage or moral judgment. Instead, they integrated them into their own continuity archives, alongside their histories of migration, adaptation, and loss. In doing so, they treated human failure not as aberration, but as a legitimate mode of learning. In parallel, they shared failures of their own that had never been disclosed to outsiders. Among these were accounts of over-adaptation, where systems became so responsive that they amplified minor fluctuations into existential threats. These failures resonated deeply with human experience, revealing a shared vulnerability that transcended biology. Through this exchange, a new understanding took shape. Endurance was not merely the capacity to persist, but the willingness to remember accurately, to resist the temptation to smooth over rough edges or rewrite outcomes as inevitable. In the unstable region, where feedback was immediate and memory mattered, such honesty became a form of infrastructure. External pressures did not abate during this inward turn. Other polities, observing the slowdown, interpreted it as opportunity. Proposals resurfaced for independent exploitation of peripheral zones, framed as low-impact ventures insulated from the core region. Humanity's response was fragmented, reflecting ongoing internal divisions. Some factions supported engagement as a way to maintain influence. Others argued for firm opposition. The enduring convergence made their position clear without issuing ultimatums. Any activity that treated the region as divisible, they stated, misunderstood its nature. Peripheral actions propagated inward. There was no meaningful boundary between core and edge. Those unwilling to accept this premise would not be accommodated. This stance placed humanity in a precarious position. Aligning fully with the convergence risked alienating potential allies. Failing to do so risked fracturing the partnership that had become foundational. The choice could not be deferred indefinitely. The turning point came not through policy, but through example. A small human research collective, operating with convergence oversight, undertook a project focused on reversal rather than expansion. They identified a localized alteration caused by early human intervention and attempted, cautiously, to undo it. The effort was meticulous, slow, and uncertain, requiring sustained attention over extended periods. For months, results were ambiguous. Then, gradually, indicators shifted. Variability returned to a pattern more consistent with pre-contact data. The change was modest, but it demonstrated something previously unproven, that presence did not only accumulate impact, but could, under specific conditions, relinquish it. The implications were profound. If harm could be mitigated without further destabilization, then responsibility extended beyond restraint to repair. Humanity seized on this possibility with cautious hope. Repair, unlike control, aligned with both human ethics and convergence philosophy. The project expanded incrementally, always within strict limits. Not every alteration proved reversible, and some attempts introduced new complications. Yet the practice of attempting repair, even when incomplete, reshaped the narrative. Humanity was no longer merely learning how to exist within the region, but how to care for it without claiming ownership. This shift resonated outward. Human governance bodies began to incorporate repair obligations into exploratory mandates, not as guarantees, but as commitments to attempt remediation when feasible. The language was careful, avoiding promises that could not be kept. It marked a maturation of intent. For Nira Valen, the change was personal. She recognized that her role had evolved from architect to steward. The distinction mattered. Architecture sought to impose form. Stewardship sought to sustain conditions under which form could emerge organically. In the unstable region, the latter was the only viable path. As the chapter drew toward its close, the joint community convened in a rare region-wide deliberation. Humans and convergence participants contributed perspectives shaped by months of slowed engagement and shared memory. No grand resolution emerged. Instead, a consensus formed around a simple principle that continued presence required continuous consent, not just between species, but between generations. The unstable region offered no assurance that such consent would always be possible. Conditions would change, priorities would shift. What mattered was the willingness to reassess, to step back when necessary, and to accept that endurance might sometimes mean letting go. In the quiet that followed the deliberation, activity resumed at a measured pace. Not expansion, not retreat, but careful continuation. Humanity remained within the region, no longer as an experimenter testing limits, but as a participant aware that limits were not obstacles to be overcome, but signals to be heeded. The stars beyond remained indifferent, but within this negotiated space, something rare persisted, a shared commitment to learning how not to dominate what could not be controlled. It was an unglamorous achievement, invisible to those seeking spectacle, yet it marked a turning point in humanity's long conversation with the universe. The passage of time within the unstable region never resolved into comfort, but it did settle into familiarity. What once felt alien became contextual, not predictable but interpretable. For those who remained, this shift carried a quiet gravity. They were no longer pioneers testing a frontier, nor caretakers preserving a fragile equilibrium. They had become witnesses to an ongoing process in which their own presence was inseparable from the phenomena they observed. Generational change arrived gradually. The first humans who had entered the region with the pilgrim thread began to rotate out permanently, returning to other parts of human space or retiring into quieter orbits. They carried with them habits of thought that did not translate easily elsewhere. In meetings and councils far from the region, they spoke with caution that was sometimes mistaken for indecision. They had learned that not every question demanded an answer, and that some answers lost their value when enforced too broadly. Those who replaced them were different from the outset. They had trained with convergence mentors as a matter of course, absorbing hybrid frameworks before ever setting foot in the region. For them, instability was not an anomaly to be corrected, but an environmental condition to be respected. They arrived without the urgency that had driven earlier missions and without the defensiveness born of novelty. This generational handoff marked a subtle but decisive transition. The partnership was no longer exceptional, it was normative. Neera Valen remained longer than she had intended. Each time she considered leaving, some unresolved thread drew her back, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. She understood now that the region was not merely a place of work. It was a lens through which to view humanity itself, magnifying tendencies that elsewhere remained diffuse. Ambition, restraint, curiosity, fear, and care all expressed themselves more clearly here, stripped of comforting illusions. The enduring convergence observed these human changes with quiet interest. Their own society had adjusted as well. Contact with humanity had introduced a different cadence of decision-making, one that tolerated dissent more openly and treated provisional agreement as sufficient. This was not universally welcomed among them. Some convergence collectives argued that the partnership introduced unnecessary volatility, that their long survival had depended precisely on minimizing such internal friction. Others countered that adaptation required exposure to difference, not just environmental, but cognitive. These debates unfolded without rupture. The convergence had long accepted internal variance as a stabilizing factor, and the presence of humanity simply expanded the space within which variance could occur. What changed was not their core principles, but their confidence that those principles could persist through deeper entanglement. The wider galaxy continued to watch. Some polities adjusted their doctrines subtly, incorporating language of adaptability and repair without fully embracing its implications. Others doubled down on control, interpreting humanity's experience as a cautionary tale about overextension. A few sent observers who stayed, learned, and carried fragments of the region's lessons back to their own cultures, often stripped of context, but still transformative. Humanity's internal discourse evolved unevenly. The unstable region became a symbol invoked by competing narratives. To some, it represented maturity, evidence that humanity could engage with complexity without conquest. To others, it was a warning against entanglement, proof that restraint led to diminished influence. These debates never resolved, but they no longer paralyzed action. humanity had learned, imperfectly, to proceed without consensus. The most consequential change, however, was not ideological but practical. The methods developed in the region began to inform human activity elsewhere. Infrastructure projects incorporated adaptive margins rather than fixed tolerances. Governance experiments allowed for reversible decisions and embedded dissent. Educational systems emphasized systems thinking over optimization. None of these shifts could be traced to a single policy or proclamation. They spread through people, through shared experience, through the quiet authority of those who had lived with consequences. Repair efforts within the region continued, limited and careful. Some scars could not be undone. Others softened over time, their impact diluted by broader dynamics. Humanity learned to accept partial success without despair, recognizing that repair was not a path back to an imagined purity, but a gesture toward balance. The enduring convergence regarded this acceptance as a significant milestone. Many civilizations, they noted, failed not because they caused harm, but because they could not tolerate the incompleteness of remediation. Eventually, the question of permanence arose again, this time without urgency. Did humanity intend to remain indefinitely? The enduring convergence did not ask out of concern or invitation, but as a matter of alignment. Long-term coexistence required clarity, even if that clarity admitted uncertainty. The human response emerged through distributed dialogue rather than declaration. There would be no permanent claim, no fixed presence guaranteed across centuries. Instead, humanity committed to conditional continuation. As long as presence contributed to mutual understanding and did not undermine the region's integrity, humans would remain. If conditions changed such that withdrawal became the more responsible choice, they would leave, carrying their lessons with them. This answer satisfied the convergence not because it promised stability, but because it preserved agency on both sides. Endurance, they had learned together, was not about holding ground, but about maintaining the capacity to choose wisely as circumstances evolved. Nera Valen finally prepared to depart during a period of relative calm. Her decision was not marked by ceremony. She transferred responsibilities to those who had trained under her, individuals who no longer needed her guidance to navigate the region's demands. On her last day, she walked once more through a joint installation, now so integrated that it was impossible to tell where human framework ended and convergence adaptation began. At a viewport, she paused, watching the familiar distortions ripple across space. They no longer felt threatening or wondrous. They simply were. She understood then that the region had given her something rare, a sense of proportion. Humanity was neither insignificant nor supreme. It was one participant among many in a universe that responded not to intention, but to action. Her departure did not diminish the partnership. Others took her place, bringing new questions and perspectives. The work continued, uneven and ongoing. There were setbacks, disagreements, and moments of renewed tension. There always would be. What endured was not harmony, but commitment. Far beyond the unstable region, stars continued their ancient cycles, indifferent to the meanings assigned to them. Humanity's ships still traveled, still explored, still erred. Yet woven into those journeys was a quiet inheritance from a place that refused simplification. An understanding that strength lay not in imposing order, but in remaining responsive to what resisted it. The measure of humanity among the stars would never be found in territory claimed or forces amassed. It would be found in the willingness to engage with what could not be mastered, to accept limits without surrender, and to choose care over conquest even when no one was watching. In the unyielding vastness of space, that choice did not echo loudly. It did not reshape galaxies or rewrite cosmic laws, but it endured, carried forward in practices, memories, and decisions yet to be made. And in that endurance, humanity found its place, not above the universe nor beneath it, but within it, learning still how to belong.